The Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations and Related Programs will come to order. Good afternoon. First of all, let me welcome all of our distinguished colleagues who are here today testifying. As the subcommittee begins to write our bill very soon and our report, we really value members' input and requests on how best to prioritize the resources that we have to support our agencies and to advance diplomacy and development. Now, as this hearing is fully virtual, let me just address a few housekeeping issues first. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noises. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask the staff to send you a request to unmute yourself. Please then accept that request so you are no longer muted. And I remind all members and our distinguished colleagues testifying that the 5-minute clock, which hopefully you're able to see, still applies during the Q&A period. If there's a technology issue, we'll move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. And you will notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining on the clock, it'll turn yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I may gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired. And when your time has expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. After our distinguished colleagues present his or her testimony, we will follow the order of recognition set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and the ranking member or his designee. Then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority. Following that, members not present at the time of the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything that they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings and markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. Good afternoon again, and let me just welcome and thank you again for attending our virtual hearing and testifying. I also want to just take a moment to recognize our newest member of our subcommittee, Congresswoman Julia Letlow. We're so glad to have you on this subcommittee, and we look forward to working with you. Hopefully we'll be able to sit down and talk soon. We've heard from many agencies and their justifications for their fiscal 2023 budget. However, it's really important to myself and other members to hear directly from you on your priorities for the fiscal 23 State and Foreign Operations bill. I'm always amazed, and I said this last year. Last year we had 6,500 member requests. This year we have 6,800 member requests. So that's a lot of requests from members of Congress, bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats, but it just shows you that members are very concerned about global affairs, which I really love. I want to welcome member testimony before the subcommittee because it really does demonstrate the value that the House puts on these important investments in building a more just, inclusive, and prosperous world. The diplomacy, development, humanitarian, and security assistance programs funded through this bill are critical to supporting the poorest and most vulnerable people, including women and children, as well as mitigating crises such as climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the war in Ukraine. Now, with limited resources, I strive to write a bill and report that takes into consideration both agency and member input. The more we can raise our collective voices about the value of these programs, the more success we will have in making sure we can secure the resources to fund them sufficiently. So distinguished colleagues, more than ever before with our international challenges, America faces a direct impact on the American people in terms of our global challenges, whether it's alleviating starvation, food insecurity, advancing women's empowerment, tackling global health, securing our partners in vulnerable countries from the malign influence of authoritarianism, increasing staff diversity and equity within our own agencies. That's just to name a few. These are challenges which necessitate the Congress cooperate, work together in a bipartisan manner, and lead. And though it's not always an easy path, I believe Congress has shown at the end of the day we can work together, especially the subcommittee, alongside the administration and our multilateral partners to provide for programs that protect the American people and their security and uplift our development and foreign policy priorities. We have one member, Congressman Kohele, who's not able to be with us this afternoon. So without objection, I would like to ask that his testimony be added to the record. Without objection. Okay, I look forward to hearing your testimonies, but before turning to our distinguished colleagues, let me yield to our ranking member, Mr. Rogers, for any opening remarks he may have. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you for yielding, Madam Chair. Before I begin, let me also say a word of welcome to the newest member of the subcommittee, Congresswoman Julia Letlow. We're looking forward to working with you, and I'm pleased to have a full contingent on the Republican side of the aisle now, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this hearing so that we may receive testimony from our colleagues on their fiscal 2023 priorities in this bill. We've already heard from the Secretary of State and USAID Administrator on details of the President's budget request for state foreign operations, which would provide an increase of nearly $10 billion over the enacted level. As I noted in previous hearings, I believe increases of this magnitude are unrealistic and create false expectations. That said, there are many important programs in this bill, many of which have strong bipartisan support. I'm pleased we get to hear from several of them today, directly from members. We thank them for their participation. And now I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers. Okay, to our distinguished colleagues, if you could summarize your oral statement in less than 5 minutes. I want to make sure we have enough time, especially given the possibility of votes being called, leave enough time to get to our questions, but your full statement will be included in the record. After your testimony, I'll be calling on members based on seniority of the members that were present when the hearing was called to order, alternating between majority and minority members, and I'll then recognize any remaining members in the order of their appearance. Each member is asked to keep their questions, once again, to within 5 minutes per round. So I will yield now to Chairman Jim McGovern.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Lee and Ranking Member Rogers. Thanks for the opportunity to testify today, and a special thank you to the staff. 6,800 requests. Oh my goodness, that's a lot. But in any event, we appreciate your work. To begin with, let me thank you for your focus on community-based development and how responsive you've been to many of my top concerns. And this committee, and especially the two of you, I believe promote the very best of U.S. values and advance America's global interests and relationships. Look, one of my top priorities for the fiscal year 23 is the request led by Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs and myself, along with Representatives Fitzpatrick, McCollum, and Kim. And we ask that you provide $1.1 billion for the maternal and child health account. This includes designating $200 million for Gavi and $300 million for the nutrition account within global health programs at USAID. The request is supported by 178 bipartisan members of Congress. I strongly urge the subcommittee to substantially increase the nutrition account. While the subcommittee has provided increases to both the MCH and global health programs accounts, these increases have not been reflected in the funds dedicated to nutrition. So we all know that interventions provided to infants, including severely malnourished children, have a tremendous bang for their buck. When we see documented reductions in stunting and improvements in maternal and child health from these proven interventions, I can't understand why increases to the nutrition account are so difficult. So our bipartisan request is to provide $300 million for the nutrition account to address the global child malnutrition and undernutrition crisis. I also want to thank you for the thoughtful and effective designations the committee has made regarding USAID to Colombia and Central America. I strongly support the attention to police reform in Colombia. Since last year, police abuses persist and reforms have failed to advance. I encourage you to strengthen your focus on this critical human rights and security issue. And I would now like to just highlight a couple of new requests for your consideration in the FY 2023. First, I asked the committee to designate $500,000 for USIP's Colombia program. I also support fully funding USIP at $54 million. In October 2021, USIP opened a permanent office in Colombia. In the worsening human rights situation confronting Colombia, the USIP Colombia program has become a critical convening space for key local and national stakeholders on a range of very sensitive issues. Its shoestring budget provides for minimal staffing and administrative costs at a time when expanding its programs could amplify its critical role as a good faith actor and mentor for peace, reconciliation, and reform inside Colombia. I understand that this is a highly unusual request to designate funds for one of USIP's many programs, but the impact of its Colombia office's staff in advancing peace building in that troubled and violent country cannot be understated. And I leave the best way to allocate such funding to your best judgment, but I firmly believe that this is an important priority. And I know nobody in Congress wishes to see Colombia repeat the horrors of the 1990s. Second, I asked for 1.5 million to be provided to the Bureau of Democracy, Labor, and Human Rights to develop a comprehensive Central American protection pilot program for judicial officials, independent media, and human rights defenders who face such extreme harassment or threats that they are forced to stop work and even go into exile. I mean, we have seen a deep erosion of judicial independence in Central America, a crackdown on independent media, and restrictions on the work of civil society. Those most affected are individuals and NGOs leading efforts to combat impunity and corruption, protect human rights, and ensure the rule of law, the very people who most share our values and vision in the region. I strongly believe it's in our interest to have a program or mechanism that ensures the safety of and provides support for these key actors so they can continue their human rights and anti-corruption work in exile. Finally, I'm asking for $10 million for peace building, reconciliation, democracy building, and food security in the Central African Republic. You know, the conflict in the Central African Republic has exacerbated religious and ethnic tensions and left 49% of the population food insecure. So while humanitarian assistance provides life-saving support, there remains massive gaps in helping civilians rebuild their lives and livelihoods. These local initiatives playing an essential role in breaking cycles of conflict and displacement and securing a more sustainable peace. So thanks for allowing me the time to speak on these priorities. Thank you for all that you do. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern. Thanks again for your testimony. And I want members to know that this is not new for you. You've been showing leadership on these issues for many, many years. And thank you also for bringing up the USIP program to our attention. That was one of the questions I was going to ask you, but thank you very much for that. Let me now yield to Mr. Rogers, see if you have any comments or questions.
I have no questions. I want to compliment the gentleman for the thoroughness of his report. Wish him luck.
Thank you.
Any other member have any question or comment? Ms. Frankel? Okay, with that, Mr. McGovern, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Your testimony will be, and full testimony will be included in the record.
All the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I will yield now to, let's see, I believe Ms. Escobar. Or
yes,
was Mr. Case next?
I'm
sorry, who was next in line, Mr. Case or Ms. Escobar? Do you know?
I'm happy to defer to Ms. Escobar.
Okay, we'll go to Ms. Escobar since I called her. I couldn't read my note here to see who was next. So, okay, Congresswoman Escobar, thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Case. Thank you, Chairwoman Lee and Ranking Member Rogers for hosting this Member Day hearing. As the representative for El Paso, Texas, I'm here to talk about an agency that most Americans have likely never heard of, but is absolutely vital for those of us who live on the southern border, the International Boundary and Water Commission, or the IBWC. As this subcommittee knows, the overall mission of the IBWC is to oversee the application of the United States-Mexico treaties, including settling differences that may arise in their application. However, the IBWC also plays a critical role in maintaining levees, dams, and other flood damage reduction activities. The United States section has been working diligently to meet the needs of communities along bodies of water like the Rio Grande. And I would like to thank the subcommittee for its steadfast leadership in increasing the agency's funding over the past several years. However, after meeting with IBWC leadership and local stakeholders in my district, in order for IBWC to meet the needs of the moment, they need substantially higher funding beginning in fiscal year 2023. That's why I'm requesting a $40 million increase for IBWC, divided evenly between the salaries and expenses and construction accounts. At the moment, the IBWC needs more funding to address 3 critical areas: dredging of sediment, levee construction and repair, and replacement of heavy equipment. Because of a lack of funds, sediment has accumulated along the Rio Grande since the late 1990s. And as a result, deferred maintenance has elevated flood risks in the vicinity of El Paso. While I've spoken with Commissioner Gilner about this issue and know she is committed to addressing it, the deferred dredging will likely cost hundreds of millions of dollars over the span of several years. And I apologize, that's Commissioner Giner. The increase I am proposing would allow IBWC to begin making a dent into the deferred dredging while also beginning to plan for yearly dredging. With regard to levees, the role IBWC plays in their construction and repair is central to reducing flood risks for border residents. However, because work on the levees has been slow due to funding constraints, they have also played a direct role in the FEMA flood mapping process. More specifically, the draft flood maps FEMA has developed for El Paso now include large swaths of homes that would not normally be placed in these flood zones. The only reason they are in flood zones is because a nearby IBWC levee is either lacking certification or needs repairs. This places an additional financial burden on homeowners to purchase flood insurance. Getting IBWC the funds necessary to expeditiously take care of the levees will reduce flood risk and allow FEMA to properly evaluate the existing flood landscape. The final funding priority is getting IBWC the funds needed to replace their existing heavy equipment. I was shocked to learn that some of the heavy equipment used in the El Paso area is simply not suitable for workers and in dire need of upgrades. Providing more funds to the Border Heavy Equipment Program will allow IBWC to replace their existing inventory with state-of-the-art construction equipment while also protecting their workers. In addition to a funding increase, we need to help bring IBWC into the 21st century. I am encouraged by Commissioner Giner's vision for IBWC and believe we should do what we can to support her. For example, engaging with institutions of higher education for research is something many other federal agencies do regularly, and they benefit greatly from it. Oftentimes, this engagement allows them to find solutions to long-standing problems that they may not have been able to find otherwise. My report language request would simply encourage the IBWC to develop a strategy for engaging in research with institutions of higher education, specifically those along the southern border. This research would be limited to the purposes of their mission, but I believe could yield results for the future of the IBWC. Many thanks to the subcommittee for this opportunity and for consideration of my requests. I yield back.
Thank you very much for that testimony, Congresswoman Escobar. I certainly know the area you're talking about. El Paso is my hometown, and thank you for representing it so well. And we look forward to following up and asking a couple questions. If votes have been called, though, but let me just see if Mr. Rogers has a question before I ask my final question of Ms. Escobar.
I have no questions, and I wish her well in this quest.
Good. Let me just ask you about the IBWC and the last 2 administrations and why they haven't asked for adequate funding. I'm just curious about that. If you can just quickly tell us what's
Chairwoman Lee, that's a great question. We tried hard to get with the last leader of the IBWC. We were unable to secure a meeting with her after multiple attempts, but the community has long been crying out for support because the lack of the dredging, the old equipment, all of that has a direct impact on our homeowners, on our commercial property owners, who then have to buy flood insurance simply because the federal government is not taking care of its own property.
Okay. Thank you very much. And with that, we have your full testimony to be included in the record.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Case. I yield back.
Okay, let me yield now to Mr. Case.
Thank you so much, Chair Lee, Ranking Member Rogers, and appropriations colleagues on this subcommittee, including Ms. Letlow. Mahalo or thank you for the opportunity to testify today in support of a solid FY 2023 bill that fully invests in U.S. engagement throughout the Indo-Pacific, but especially the Pacific Islands. The Pacific Islands region spans the vast expanse of ocean from Easter Island and Hawaii to the shores of New Zealand, Australia, Indonesia, and Asia. The nations spread throughout these waters control a combined exclusive economic zone larger than the landmass of China and Russia combined. We share centuries, indeed millennia, in the case of Hawaii and other Pacific parts of our country, of values, culture, and history with the Pacific Islands. Of course, in World War II, our nation lost countless of our own on these islands and the surrounding seas. And we have been a full partner in the present and future of the Pacific in the 3 generations hence. In this Indo-Pacific century, our relationships throughout the Pacific are paramount. The priorities of these nations are familiar because their fate is tied to our own in so many ways. Climate change is an existential threat for the Pacific Islands as rising sea levels have already begun to subsume their communities. Their economies have been ravaged by COVID-19, and they are increasingly forced to the front lines of the geopolitical challenge with China. Successive nonpartisan, bipartisan administrations and Congresses have emphasized the urgent need to shift our foreign policy focused westward. But now is indeed the time to fund a coordinated U.S. government strategy for engagement in the Pacific Islands. The President's recently released Indo-Pacific Strategy speaks to the region's importance and commits to bolstering U.S. diplomatic engagement and cooperation with Pacific Island nations on mutual priorities. We must assure that this strategy is fully authorized, fully funded, and fully implemented. There are many interrelated components, but to name just a few: the full return of the Peace Corps, bolstering efforts to combat illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, supporting training and scholarships for Pacific Islanders to study in the United States, especially through proven institutions such as the East-West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii, increasing our attaché, consular, and embassy presence, and providing support for climate resilience projects, civil society, and trade development. Each initiative that we fully authorize, fund, and implement sends a clear message to the Pacific Islands that we stand with them in the face of mutual challenges, and that the United States is a neighbor and partner that they can count on to continue to share our common aspirations for a regional order free of coercion and fully respectful of democracy, human rights, and the sovereignty of all nations. In 2019, I co-founded the Bipartisan Pacific Islands Caucus to increase awareness of the importance of the Pacific Islands within Congress. We have worked to ensure that the Pacific Islands are not overlooked in our approach to the Indo-Pacific. We have produced legislation like the Blue Pacific Act to ensure we include the region in our strategy for Indo-Pacific engagement. In fact, the United States Innovation and Competition Act and the Americompetes Act contain provisions from the Blue Pacific Act, which, if funded, would be truly transformative for our approach to this region. The Asia Reassurance Initiative Act of 2018 provides many of the authorizations needed to fund the Indo-Pacific and Pacific Islands related provisions of USICA and competes. However, this is only possible with specific carve-outs and designations for the Pacific Islands in the educational and cultural exchange, international disaster assistance, development assistance, and global health programming accounts. Without funding to support strategic engagement in the Indo-Pacific, it becomes too easy for administrative inertia or diversion to stall our best intentions. I urge you to craft the fiscal year 2023 State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill that supports a comprehensive whole of government approach to U.S. engagement in the Pacific Islands. We have made progress through renewed diplomatic and other efforts to engage Pacific leaders, including Secretary Blinken's and Congress's own travels in the region. However, without funding to support specific initiatives, visits alone and promises made will ring hollow. Now is the time to ensure that our foreign policy budget reflects the importance of our ties to the Pacific Islands and our support for a secure and stable Indo-Pacific, committed to an order based on mutual respect, cooperation, and freedom. Thank you so much for considering my thoughts and my requests.
Thank you very much, Congressman Case. We certainly do need to do more in the Pacific and with the Pacific Islands, and I appreciate your leadership on this. And thank you for introducing the Blue Pacific Act to really give a roadmap on how we strengthen our engagement in the Pacific Islands. I will yield now to Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me thank Mr. Case for his interest in the Indo-Pacific. It's impressive. Bipartisan consensus has emerged on the importance of the Indo-Pacific region to American national interests. One critical but often neglected area of competition with China is among the Pacific Island countries that Mr. Case knows so well. What additional areas of economic, diplomatic, or cultural engagement would you emphasize if resources allow?
Thank you so much, Ranking Member, and I appreciate very much your support. And to your point, we need look no further than the recent agreement between the Solomon Islands and China for, if we ever needed it, some kind of a warning shot as to the fork in the road we face with the Pacific Islands right now. I would say to your question, I was just in the Pacific Islands on a bipartisan congressional delegation just a few weeks ago, and I want to emphasize one area where I think it is critical for us to assist, and that is maritime security. The Pacific Islands depend on the enforcement of their rights in their exclusive economic zones. As you know, China is busy trying to rewrite the law on exclusive economic zones in the South China Sea and elsewhere. And these countries are subject to many, many threats and many initiatives to essentially erode their rights and give access to other countries to their EEZs. This is a matter of survival for them. And so maritime security is a particular area that they particularly need assistance with, and that they particularly welcome, by the way. It is an area where, for example, our Coast Guard is involved in almost all of the Pacific Islands. In fact, I think it is all of the Pacific Islands in one way or the other. Even islands that don't particularly, are a little skittish about the participation of our other armed services. Trade is going to be another very, very critical area, but the areas within the jurisdiction of this subcommittee and others all are going to be critical to whether we actually do boost our re-engagement in the Pacific Islands.
Thank you very much.
Are there any additional questions? Okay, if not, thank you again, Congressman Case. Thank you for yielding to Ms. Escobar out of order, and thank you for your testimony. We'll be sure to include it in the record.
Thank you very much.
Now I would like to yield to Congresswoman Garcia. We still have probably about 300 members who haven't voted, but we're trying to move so that we can complete this, but if not, we'll come back after vote. So what are you all seeing? How many minutes are left on the clock? Can you tell? Okay, I'll yield now to Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll be less than 5 minutes, and I'm proxying for about 3 or 4 people, so I do need to get the floor just like everybody else. So I appreciate your consideration, and thank you to our Ranking Member Rogers and all the committee members for having me here today to share my fiscal year 2023 priorities for the Appropriations Subcommittee on State, Foreign Operations, and Related Programs. I am proud to represent Texas's 29th Congressional District. This includes parts of Houston, South Houston, Pasadena, Jacinto City, and Galena Park. I am a strong advocate for the LGBTQ community in my community and abroad. Unfortunately, at least 68 countries have lost or criminalized same-sex sexual relations, between consenting adults, and at least 9 countries have laws criminalizing forms of gender expression that target trans people. This is unacceptable. Nobody should be discriminated against or denied their human rights just for being who they are. As a defender of human rights for LGBTQ people around the world, I am proud to sign and support Representative Cicilline's FY23 appropriations request letter to support funding for LGBTQIA+ individuals globally. Specifically, this letter requests $30 million for the Global Equality Fund at the State Department and $30 million for the Equal Rights in Action Fund at USAID, which are funded through this subcommittee. As members of Congress, we should be committed to the pursuit of global equality. Equality for all, no matter what you look like, where you're from, or who you love. And that's why this request urges appropriators to invest in LGBTQI+ rights around the world. U.S. foreign assistance programs at the State Department and USAID have been vital in supporting LGBTQI+ people and are embedded in broader initiatives that support democracy, human rights, and economic development. Funding these programs will allow the United States to restore its leadership in this area and support our global citizens. Coincidentally, today is also International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia, which was founded to draw attention to the violence and discrimination experienced by LGBTQI+ people around the world. In honor of today's International Day, I ask for your strong consideration of these funding requests. I appreciate all the members' time today, and I'd be happy to answer the questions should you have any. Madam Chair, with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Garcia. The LGBTQ+I community has been largely marginalized and subject to discrimination and violence for simply wanting basic human dignity. So thank you for calling this to our attention. I will yield now to Mr. Rogers.
Madam Chair, I have no questions.
Any additional questions? If not, thank you very much for being with us today. Your full testimony will be included in the record, and we will proceed accordingly. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you,
Garcia.
Madam Chair, and I'll see you on the floor.
Okay, take care. Thank you for bringing this to us. Okay, I will now yield to Representative Radewagen. Am I pronouncing your name correctly, please?
Yes.
Thank you for being with us. Please proceed.
Hello, Falava. Thank you, Chairwoman Lee and Ranking Member Rogers, for the opportunity to testify today on the need of an increase of U.S. investment in the Pacific Island region in the FY 2023 Appropriations Bill. The United States is a Pacific Island nation. We have been a Pacific Island nation for over 100 years. However, since the end of the Cold War, we've forgotten our commitments to the region. Unfortunately, in that time, new challenges have arisen in the region. China is increasingly making their presence felt. In neighboring Samoa, they've invested in building a dual-use airport less than 80 miles from American Samoa. But it's not just Samoa that China is influencing. Just earlier this year, China signed a security agreement with the Solomon Islands, but did not do so transparently. Active U.S. involvement can prevent other small Pacific Island states from being taken advantage of by China. However, China does not represent the existential threat to the Pacific like climate change does. Rising sea levels threaten to completely cover some islands in the near future. Every small Pacific Island country says that climate change is their biggest national security concern. And it's not just climate change that is threatening Pacific Island countries. COVID-19 has completely isolated Pacific Island countries, many of whom don't have the resources in case of a major outbreak. We, as the United States, have the ability to counteract the threats of China, climate change, and COVID in the SFOP's appropriations bill. We need a unified whole of government Indo-Pacific strategy that addresses the concerns of our neighbors in the region. And I believe, like Congressman Case, that thorough engagement is critical. I humbly ask that the committee increase funding of accounts and programs that engage the U.S. in the Pacific. Such programs include development assistance, diplomatic programs, international disaster assistance, education, and cultural exchange programs. These accounts fund programs that allow the United States to develop bonds with government officials and civil society of Pacific Island countries, one of which I'm passionate about is the Young Pacific Leaders Program, which strengthens bonds of the Pacific's future leaders with young leaders in the United States. These bonds are important for future generations. Another which I care about is education scholarships for Pacific Island students. China is greatly outcompeting us on this front. They are providing education to young Pacific Islander students who then go on to work in the governments of Pacific Island countries. We can compete. We have the best universities in the world, and we can provide that education with scholarships to Pacific Island students. For the United States to maintain and deepen its relationships in the region, we must put real resources towards our diplomatic presence, partnerships for development, and engagement with civil society. Thank you for your time and for consideration of the needs of the people of the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And as I said earlier, we must acknowledge that we need to do more with the Pacific Islands and also recognize the existential threat that small islands face, especially with climate change and many of the other issues you laid out. So thank you very much for bringing this to our attention. I will yield now to Mr. Rogers if he has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I noted earlier the bipartisan consensus on the importance of the Indo-Pacific region to American national interests. China's apparent military inroads in the Solomon Islands shows us the dangers of taking our eyes off the ball. While we have strong historical relationships with many of these countries dating back to World War II, it's critical we do not take them for granted. In your view, Ms. Radewagen, has the State Department and USAID been paying enough attention to the region?
Well, the short answer is no. They have been, but they need to pay much more attention because we are losing these areas. And China is all over these areas like a cheap suit, Mr. Rogers.
All right, thank you very much.
I yield now to Representative Espaillat.
Thank you, Representative Radewagen. The problem is sometimes they make expensive suits too. And they sell them, they peddle them, not just in the Indo-Pacific Islands, it is also in the Caribbean. And so, for example, island nations' abilities to have disaster resilience, as they stand on the pathway of hurricanes, is very costly, and often China and others come in for with financing for important disaster resilience projects in the Caribbean, as well as the energy issue in the Caribbean, which continues to be a major problem. The cost of energy, as it is here in the United States as well, has gone through the roof, and of course that has impacted the cost of food and other emergency items. And so we must lead in providing financing. China provides 1% interest loans to those island nations and other countries. And of course, they have no other choice but to go there to address some of these very urgent needs. You have, for example, maternal health care in the Dominican Republic and Haiti. We've spoken about that in this committee in the language last time around about providing funding to address the maternal care costs of Haitian women in Haiti and the DR, as well as the Caribbean Basic Security Initiative, which is one that addresses security in the region, it reduces corruption in the region, it strengthens the ability again to respond to natural disasters. So I know that island nations are often facing these very difficult choices when it comes to natural disasters and the environment. So Representative Radderwagen, I want to know what kind of initiatives you're putting in the other part of the world to address this that require our intervention. Are there any particular projects that you may have that I think are worthy in the Indo-Pacific Islands?
Well, the short answer would be, of course, climate change and COVID issues. Those are important, not only in the Pacific region, but in your region as well, the Caribbean.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. If there are no additional questions, let me thank you for being with us today and once again calling our attention to the importance of the Indo-Pacific region and for your testimony. It will be included in the record and we look forward to working with you. Thank you again. I will now yield to Representative Malinowski. I believe we still have time. We'll try to, okay, 133 members have not voted yet, so we'll be able to get through your testimony. Representative Malinowski, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Chairwoman Lee and Ranking Member Rogers. I wanted to come here today just first and foremost to thank you both for your bipartisan support for an America that shows up around the world, an America that leads. We all, many of us in Congress, have ambitious ideas about what America should be doing around the world, supporting our allies, standing up for our values, standing down adversaries, whether Russia and Ukraine or China in the Asia Pacific. And yet not all of our colleagues recognize the importance of actually resourcing the State Department to be able to do the things that we demand that they do, which, as you all know, they do with less than 1% of the federal budget. I also wanted to thank you both for putting up with me and all of our colleagues who come at you with letters and requests, helping us move the needle on dozens of issues that are important to us around the world. And in particular, I know how much work has gone into recently bicameral negotiations on trying to elevate human rights as a factor in US military aid in the Middle East and other parts of the world. I can tell you as a former senior State Department official, the State Department frequently is proud of itself for how it uses tools that Congress imposed upon it against its will. Whether it's the Leahy Law that affects how we do military assistance and training around the world, or the Magnitsky Human Rights Act, which allows for sanctions against human rights abusers. All these things were opposed by State Departments under both Democratic and Republican administrations, and they're now incredibly proud of how they work with us to actually use these tools. And it's something to keep in mind as we conduct our oversight. I'm also here to draw your attention to a letter that I led with 20 colleagues requesting a bump up to the budget for the State Department officers that oversee arms transfers around the world. Security assistance is one of the most visible and defining elements of our relationships with a lot of countries around the world, from Colombia to Niger to Egypt. The scale of our military aid often dwarfs our economic assistance, and it sometimes generates a perception that the United States is the guarantor of the regimes of those countries. Sometimes it associates us with abuses committed by their security forces. And as arms transfers overseas have boomed, the personnel support at the State Department overseeing those transfers has stagnated. By our calculations, the State Department has to sign off on the human rights risks associated with weapons export licenses every 5 minutes. One sign off every 5 minutes, and that's only with a handful of staff. So we urge your committee, myself and a number of other colleagues, to consider providing a boost to the State Department resourcing that would help to make up the difference between what they have budgeted and what we're actually asking them to do to enforce the laws that we put into place. So I hope you're able to consider that as you look to next year's bill. And then finally, I know we have had many conversations about the urgent importance of making sure America does our part to fight the COVID epidemic in countries that can't always afford to do so on their own. I think all of us approach our role as stewards of our foreign affairs with a spirit of generosity. We may be personally moved by the humanitarian elements of this challenge of helping developing countries defeat this disease, but there's also a very, very significant national interest. I talk about this all the time in my district, and I say I'd much rather beat this pandemic in Africa than have to beat it again in New Jersey. The worst thing that could happen is another variant that shuts down the American economy again. And we can either fight it for a few $1 billion around the world or a few $1 trillion in America. And I know that that members of this subcommittee agree with that, and we'll continue to work together to try to make it happen. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me just say how much we appreciate your advocacy on all of these issues and your strong advocacy. I've long been concerned about our human rights concerns and issues taking a backseat in our security assistance policies. And hopefully we'll have a revised policy that requires stringent human rights reviews prior, mind you, to the approval of arms sales. So thank you for raising also the issue of COVID, because what affects one affects all, and we're going to hopefully get this done sooner or later, but keep fighting hard. We appreciate it. I'll yield to Mr. Rogers now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for your testimony. We look forward to working with you. I yield back.
Okay, Mr. Espaillat, I see your hand up. That may have been for a prior question. Okay, if not, let me just say, Mr. Malinowski, your full testimony will be submitted for the record, and we will seriously consider the proposals you presented to us today. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Let's go vote.
Yes. Okay, so let me thank our colleagues for taking time to come and testify, but also for all of you who are still with us on the subcommittee for hanging in there. We're gonna, of course, keep the record open for, I think, 7 days so we can receive testimony and submit it for the record. So this concludes today's hearing. Ms. Letlow, they don't move this quickly all of the time, but really happy you were able to be with us today. So this concludes our hearing. The Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations and Related Programs stand adjourned. And I want to thank all of the staff for helping us get through this.